Resident Evil 4 was developed and published by Capcom. It stands as the latest entry in the long-running Resident Evil franchise, which, personally speaking, this is one of the few remaining existing video game franchises that hasn't been ruined in the modern industry thanks to criticisms from older entries prior to the start of the 8th generation. Capcom has brought something special to the industry with these remakes of their classic Resident Evil games that has inspired other publishers to remake other classic games with exorbitant AAA budgets and lavish updates to improve upon the original experience. Resident Evil 4 serves as the most recent of these remakes, coming just 2 months after the fantastic Dead Space remake, which was a near flawless victory for EA. But even more importantly, this game serves as a remake to Resident Evil 4, which is considered in the industry as a whole to be one of the greatest video games ever made, as it revolutionized third-person shooters with the over-the-shoulder perspective that's still widely used in games of this type today. This is also coming off the Resident Evil 3 remake, which, while a decent game, the response to that one was less than stellar. So it was known for a long time, well over a year, that Capcom was working discreetly behind the scenes on a remake to Resident Evil 4, but after they rushed Resident Evil 3 to market by cutting too much content out of the original with some questionable design and pacing decisions for that particular game, this game was delayed for a while. Internally, Capcom was reported to be of a divided party, with the development team working on this. One side stated that they wanted the game to be a one-to-one recreation of the original Resident Evil 4. The other side held the stance that they wanted the game to diverge from the original. Fast forward a few years and the final result is that they've met somewhere in the middle, although the former seems to have won out over the latter. Now, as of this recording, I've completed the game twice from start to finish, once on hardcore mode and once again on the hardest difficulty professional mode, which features the lack of autosaves with the parry mechanic working only on perfect timing. And I've acquired more than half of the achievements thus far. Regarding the quality of this game, both as a remake of the original and just as a product that stands on its own, the Resident Evil 4 remake, similar to the Resident Evil 2 remake, is a damn near perfect game from start to finish. Not only that, it's more of a faithful remake to the original game than Resident Evil 2 was. There wasn't as much content that was cut from this game versus its original counterpart compared to the last 2 Resident Evil remakes. Most of the content that was in the original was faithfully recreated in one way or another here, and the changes that were established, either as a removal or as an addition and or replacement, improve upon the weaknesses of the original game in most cases. One of the biggest issues with the original Resident Evil 4 was its length. Behind Resident Evil 6, the 4th game in the franchise was rather long, clocking in at around 15 hours give or take. The remake, on the other hand, is either shorter or even longer depending on if the player goes out of their way to hunt down treasures and complete requests in the map. This was a brilliant change because it gives the player the choice to either speedrun their way through the game, which would make more sense to do so, I'd say, after at least 2 full playthroughs, or the player could take their time and hunt down the treasures on the map to gain access to a greater economy of currency used for important weapon upgrades, as well as inventory upgrades. Again, this is easily one of the strongest changes brought forth into the experience that Capcom implemented. Just briefly going over the treasure system, the remake opts for a greater, almost RPG-like but not quite approach, with a greater focus on resource management in the remake versus the original. This, again, is a huge improvement over the original. The way it works is that you purchase cheap expanded maps that will show you exactly on the map where the treasures are located. It's then up to you to use the map as a resource to hunt down where the treasures are, should you choose to do so. But it's not just normal treasures like a variety of jewels that make a welcome return. Rather, it's the newly added treasures that make the biggest difference. Capcom implemented unique treasures that have empty slots that you again have the choice to fill with an assortment of jewels that come in 2 different shapes and sizes, and a variety of different colors. The added jewels will increase the worth of that particular treasure, which will allow the player to siphon off that item to the beloved merchant character for greater value versus selling that treasure without any or a limited number of jewels attached. When fully stocked with jewels, these unique treasure items can and will sell for thousands upon thousands of in-game currency, effectively making the expensive weapons and the upgrades that come with them accessible to the player's benefit. The new treasure resource system is such an important addition to the game because it encourages exploration on the player's behalf, and in turn increases the length of the game without it feeling artificial since it ties in with one of the game's important systems, and places emphasis on resource management, which isn't just applied to the weapons but also to the player's currency as well. That's not all that Capcom added that ties in with this system either. There's been an implementation of shooting galleries in the game which will give the player unique coins that can then be used in increments of 3 in a toy vending machine, literally. The toys are what's known as charms that grant the player important perks. They can be equipped 3 at a time on your storage case and can be swapped out at any time you're at a typewriter save point. There's 32 of them in total, and they come in a few forms similar to RPG gear items, with common, epic, rare, and legendary charms. The higher the rarity, the greater the perk. You have perks for item crafting, perks for consumable boosts, such as herbs, perks for character performance, and perks for discounts with the merchant. The player's reliance on this system is absolutely critical, as it will be the difference between the game being a good time or being a frustrating mess depending on the specific difficulty chosen at the beginning. The coins from the shooting galleries come in 2 varieties, silver and gold. Gold coins can only be rewarded if the player has achieved a specific high score outlined in the information before the commencement of a particular challenge. And I will add that the shooting galleries are actually quite difficult, many of them. I did achieve an S rank, the highest rank possible, with every single gallery challenge, and it was not easy to do so. I restarted many of them over and over, trying out different tactics until I got the result I was looking for. Even when you understand exactly what gun the game gives you that it wants you to use if the challenge contains multiple firearms, a great deal of skill and luck decides whether or not you achieve that precious S rank.
Rifle can take 3, 2, 1, begin! Superb shot! Beautiful! Superb shot! Double kill! Triple kill! Reload! That's the stuff! Very good! Incredible! That's it! Let the bonus time begin! And that's the game! You've dominated every game I got! You're a legend, mate!
I've personally unlocked a little more than half of all the charms, which are given out to the player based on RNG. So the treasure system, which includes the shooting galleries, were a significant addition to this game. And I also appreciated the request system from the merchant, who will give you simple tasks to complete in specified areas of the map in exchange for special items to unlock rewards that are otherwise unattainable. This also adds to the replayability, although I felt that they should have limited the number of these tasks, especially since most of them repeat the same conditions throughout the runtime. Another brilliant change was the titular character Ashley, the president's daughter that Leon is tasked with retrieving. In the original game, Ashley was a nuisance, a helpless damsel in distress that did nothing but grate on the player's nerves whenever she was on screen, and the player was tossed into a combat scenario. For the most part, Ashley is still a helpless damsel in distress that can be picked up and carried off by the enemy AI to the nearest exit in the area. Or she can also be shot and killed accidentally by the player, which can lead to a very frustrating game over screen, forcing the player to start again from the most recent checkpoint. However, there are some valuable needed changes that Capcom inserted to make Ashley bearable. First and foremost is the command system. As Leon, the player can give Ashley one of 2 commands, either stick close to Leon or to withdraw apart from him. And the AI controlling Ashley is competent at performing both actions, thankfully. Depending on the situation, you'll want Ashley to be close to Leon or to have her stay at a distance depending on the threat on screen. For example, if you have a small room and or area that contains a large number of threats, You'll want Ashley to stick close to Leon so that you can always keep track of her, and doing so will make the AI getting to her more difficult. However, if you have a larger room that contains enemies coming from one area or small spot, a cramped space that has a stronger threat, you'll want Ashley to distance herself from Leon to decrease the possibility of her taking damage. That's not all. Capcom also added something very important to Ashley's gameplay, which is if she's down in combat, she'll enter a last chance state, where if she sustains another hit, it's game over. Or you can just go to her and pick her up so that doesn't happen. These two changes are critical to the extreme because they essentially take a frustrating element from the original game and make it a non-issue in the remake. Beyond those two changes, there is the combat system itself, which is very much Resident Evil 4 remade with a modern graphical presentation. Now you can shoot and move at the same time, but they slowed Leon's speed to where it doesn't drastically feel different from the original game. Of course, this does create some issues in certain areas of the game with Leon's speed, particularly the final boss of the game, where he moves a little bit too slow, and at random intervals becomes ineffective as a result. The melee moves are still there. Leon will perform a roundhouse kick or a full suplex depending on which direction the target is facing to him. The game relies on the player executing either headshots or targeting the legs for execution-style actions with the knife. The pacing of the combat system and the way the camera has been designed, always sticking close to the player's backside for a cinematic feel, gives the remake its own unique spin on the classic Resident Evil action-era gameplay, which started with the original. When I say it works, it fucking works a great deal, and the fun factor shoots through the roof. This is a system that was carefully tested again and again until they perfected it. Another element that many video games struggle with is enemy placement. This game in particular handles that almost to perfection. I count maybe 3 times where I genuinely got frustrated with the enemy placement. The game of course wants you to use different methods to get through the combat scenarios, and it gives you the tools to experiment, which is important for a survival horror game. The combat system is one of the many highlights with this remake, and I'm much looking forward to trying out Mercenaries mode when it releases in early April next month. Another change that was added is the inclusion of stealth. The only Resident Evil games that have any sort of stealth incorporated is Resident Evil 7, and less so with Resident Evil Village. Overall, the franchise doesn't lean much at all on stealth gameplay. Seeing it here in the Resident Evil 4 remake the way that it was designed was a brilliant thing to see, as it emphasizes the appearance of certain enemies on screen, such as the Garradors.
Can't see me.
Damn it!
The stealth system, which I was worried about a bit before the release of the full product, because I wasn't sure how it was actually going to be utilized, as it turns out, the stealth system works very similarly to the stealth system in The Last of Us. I believe that's where the inspiration for this element came from. In The Last of Us games, most of the combat encounters rely on the player outsmarting the AI, mainly through sneaking up on them and causing distractions. Because this is a remake to Resident Evil 4, the system here isn't as deep by comparison, as this is still primarily an action game. However, the stealth system as it was brought forth here gives the gameplay more dimension and prevents the game from being just a straight action experience all the way through. Survival elements like this emphasizes the survival part in survival horror, which is what a Resident Evil game is supposed to be to begin with. The stealth system is a most welcome change that the original actually could have greatly benefited from. One of the final major changes is the presentation of the characters and the overall tone of the dialogue.
Wait here.
What? Okay.
It's a break! What? Are you serious?
Ooh, you have the stench of battle on you, mate. Try your hand at a new gun, stranger. Might save your life. Where you gonna put this? Your pocket?
Why?
Recovering stolen goods. And killing a few rats along the way. Easy work. Not good. We are just getting started, rookie.
You can stop right there, Leon. Wouldn't make me use this, would you?
Well, after 6 years, that is one hell of a greeting, Ada.
You don't seem surprised. Interesting.
Try using knives next time. Better for close encounters.
Not a bad move. Very smooth.
So who are you working for this time?
Oh, Leon. You know I don't work in town.
When that happened, I wasn't myself anymore. I was something else.
She must have been terrifying. I know.
You too?
It's okay to be afraid, you know. But you can't run. You gotta keep moving forward. We will beat this. Together.
I don't know if I can.
You can. Just give me a heads up before you stab me next time, okay?
Leon, thanks.
The original Resident Evil 4, like other entries in the series, was known to be very, very campy with B-movie dialogue, so cringe that it puts a smile on your face. This so bad it's good approach to the dialogue gave the game a lighthearted tone that has only elevated its legacy in the business. The characters, however, had basically no dimension, including Leon himself, and were not a strong element of the story as a whole. It's a good thing the gameplay was so good that it fully made up for this pitfall. The remake takes a different approach. The characters, specifically Leon and Ashley, are given a more modern approach to video game dialogue, both in cutscenes and, even more importantly, in-game, both in and outside of combat. And the dialogue here is written to be conversational, which makes it feel authentic and gives the characters more weight in terms of dimension versus the original. This mainly applies to just Leon and Ashley. Other characters that greatly benefited from the added dialogue is Luis and the Merchant, who showcases a greater range of personality without actually changing the greedy nature of the character. The other characters in the game come off as background noise, specifically the villains, who aren't given enough screen time to be developed the way Leon and Ashley are. Nonetheless, the villains appear only in moments where they were in the original game, and they updated Salazar's appearance, greatly altering his look from the original, so you can actually somewhat take the character seriously. The B-movie dialogue is still in the game, but it's been toned down significantly from the original. It's still greatly effective, appearing both in and out of cutscenes, and most of the lines they gave Leon actually stick, as they don't come off as too cheesy or grating.
Out of the way.
Are you okay?
Yeah. Nighty-night. Nights.
Skills. You sure you're all right? You're not burned, are you?
No, thanks for your help.
The best and most important change is the parry system and the improvements to the knife. I can't fucking stress enough how critical this change was. The way it works is that when an enemy is just about to attack you, you simply hit the upper left shoulder button and Leon will block or parry that move. This is a much needed addition, as for one, it adds to the emphasis on action gameplay in a way that doesn't take away from what the game is. For two, it's extremely responsive and extremely useful. You can parry attacks from almost every single enemy in the game, big or small, including a number of attacks from the bosses. Now, you can't parry every attack, as that would have made the mechanic overpowered, making the game too easy. But it makes the game more fun and fair when you're backed into a corner and you're given an option to get yourself out of that corner without the enemies ganging up on you, which only happened 1 or 2 times for me. The first time I was actually low on ammunition, which was likely my fault. The second time was on Capcom's choice of enemy placement, but it was only an issue that one time. The knife has been changed from being a side weapon to a full-on option as part of your overall arsenal. It can be broken, damaged in combat, but its durability and strength can be upgraded a great deal, an option that wasn't available in the original. And similar to the other ammunition types, the game supplies the player with enough knives along with your main one at a healthy rate. The changes to the knife, which includes the parry system, is, again, a brilliant addition. It forces the player to be conservative with the way they use the weapon, and it just feels so much better to control in the remake versus the original. The knife was such an improvement that I went out of my way to make sure that was one of the weapons that I fully upgraded, along with one of my pistols. This is a much needed and significant improvement over the original game. Lastly, this isn't a change per se, but it was great seeing that Capcom didn't cut any of the major enemies that appeared in the original Resident Evil 4, like they did with both the Resident Evil 2 remake and especially the Resident Evil 3 remake, which suffered greatly from this flaw. The blinded claw-wielding Garradors, the nearly unstoppable impervious Regeneradors, and my personal favorite, the insect-like Novistadors, which includes their camouflaged versions, all make appearances to great effect in this remake. They're just as fun to fight in this game, if not more so than the original, given the new combat options not available in the original, such as the parry system. And they look fucking great on screen in all of their modern HD and 4K glory. I will give Capcom great props for not making significant cuts to the enemies. As for the new enemies, there were 2 that I noticed. The female chainsaw wielders, which are a faster version of their male counterparts, and the spider-like parasites that can attach themselves to enemies, significantly increasing their speed and damage output. I didn't care much for either, but I also didn't dislike or hate them. They fit in with the other enemy units in the game. I will say that these new enemy types do not work when presented in greater numbers, but since that rarely happens, it's not a big issue. So thus far, the Resident Evil 4 remake is a very strong recreation of the original game with improvements to the currency economy, inclusion of stealth elements, presentation of tone and approach to character development, gameplay improvements, and flexible pacing. However, the game, as great as it is, isn't perfect. There's a few parts from the original game that were removed here in the remake. Not too many, but they're significant enough to mention here. The first is that while Ada Wong is in the game, and she looks and sounds fantastic in the remake, her small segment in the castle act of the game has been removed. Why? I'm not really certain, other than perhaps Capcom intends for her section to be included as DLC. Or they have greater DLC plans for Ada in general. Which makes sense considering that the Separate Ways DLC from the original Resident Evil 4 has been reportedly data mined. So there's assuming that more Ada content is coming. Now, as for why her section was removed from the main game itself, maybe they figured that her section in the original game wasn't a great addition in the first place and didn't feel it necessary to include it in the remake, but it's rather disappointing that she's not playable. For now. Perhaps she will be playable in Mercenaries mode. I hope so, at least. Another piece of content that was removed is the U3 boss fight, which was actually one of my personal favorites from the original game. Why it was removed here in the remake? Again, I don't know. But I was anxiously awaiting that boss's appearance, and it was not included, so that was disappointing as well. Something else that bothered me to a lesser degree is the speed at which Leon switches his weapons. There's a slight delay at times where you need to switch to a different weapon, but Leon takes his sweet-ass time in doing so. Again, not a major problem, but it's worth noting still. The fact that you can actually switch weapons with 8 different slots, 2 on each directional button without having to constantly bring up the case menu like the original, is yet another welcome change that serves as an improvement. Finally, there's the changes to certain bosses. There were 3 bosses in particular that I wasn't a fan of. 2 of them weren't terrible and I just didn't care for the remake's version of them, and 1 was actually extremely frustrating and I can't believe they changed it from the original. The first 2 that I'm talking about includes the Del Lago Lake Monster boss, the first major boss encounter from the Village Act at the beginning. While the presentation of this boss is spot on with the original, my problem with it is that the Del Lago creature spends too much time underwater, making it impossible for the player to actually deal damage. Therefore, it became more frustrating than it should have been. Maybe this was in line with the original, but it was still annoying nonetheless. The second boss is the final one with Sadler. This boss was annoying as well, mainly for it jumping all over the place periodically, especially towards the tail end of the fight. It was a good idea throwing weaker versions of the Novistadors on screen to give the player more item and ammunition resources, all the while adding to the presentation of the fight itself. So it wasn't terrible, but I felt that the actual stage itself was the biggest drawback. It was simply too limiting as to where the player could go, whereas the original provided more space for the player to move in. The QTE dodges, for the most part, were removed for some strange reason, with the exception of 1 attack. This effectively takes the action out of the experience. The original game definitely does this fight better than the remake, without question. Lastly, there's the Salazar boss fight. And I must ask, what the fuck were they thinking? This is the most frustrating and agonizingly terrible part of the game. Just one word. Horrible. Just fucking horrible. Salazar in the original is a stationary boss where the player can drop down to a different level to fight him from below and avoid attacks. The remake is designed this way as well, except for one major change. Salazar can actually move this time, and that's the problem overall with this boss. It's understandable that the development team clearly looked at the fight in the original and decided that it was too easy with the boss remaining in one spot the entire time, and wanted the fight to be more dynamic instead of static design-wise. But the way they tackled the change here is beyond dog shit. Salazar here moves around constantly too much to where keeping up with him is annoying. He's given several attacks that are hard to avoid, and some that stun Leon completely for too long. Even moving up and down the stairs is ill-advised, as he's given an attack to damage the player for simply trying to reach a different level of the stage. There's very little cover here that the player can take to avoid his attacks, making the best strategy available is to stick with this broken pillar on the far side. The problem here is that you're literally pinned in one spot the entire time. This boss, the way it's been presented in this game, is so bad that had they added supplemental enemies for Leon to deal with, it would have just made the fight completely unbearable. And I bet that was the original intention, where Capcom was experimenting with the idea of adding enemies but couldn't find a way to do so that would in their eyes be considered as fun. They should have scrapped the entire idea and just did a more faithful rendition of the Salazar fight from the original game instead of the bullshit mess that we got. Overall, the Resident Evil 4 remake is a splendid effort from Capcom. It's another sign of the company's willingness and change over the years to listen to its fanbase and critics to improve upon its products. After the lazy Resident Evil 3 remake, they knew they couldn't just release any random thing to market, especially with Resident Evil 4. They went above and beyond to bring their best efforts to recreating a masterpiece, and they did so gracefully. The game successfully brings back what made the original special, while at the same time introducing new gameplay elements, presentation of characters and story to provide a greater, more definitive version of a classic. This remake is the most content-laced remake from Capcom thus far, and it's a sign of hopefully greater things to come down the line. After this game, I personally would like to see a remake to Resident Evil 5, as there are elements in here that could easily be applied to that game and improve upon the original in spades. Whether or not that happens is a wait and see. Until then, Resident Evil 4 stands as a faithful remake that declares a bright future for the franchise as a whole.
Thank you for saving me.
Don't mention it.
You know, I could put in a word with my dad. Have you assigned to my detail, if you're interested?
You don't need me. You proved you could handle yourself. Even if you could use a lesson in knife safety. Come on. Let's go home.